Hello, welcome back to Composition 2. Today we'll be taking Lecture 9, still in the Chapter 3, Gender and Relationships. Today we will discuss Exercise 2 on page 52, and that is a set of questions that we want to consider together and see how they are significant and how they can help us in developing our writing. Now, if you would care to turn your books to this exercise, and as you can notice in the box, let me just read the directions real quick. Find other examples of contrast expressions in the article, underline them, and notice the way each fits grammatically into the sentence. Then combine the following sentences using a different contrast expression from the box in each. This is very, this is something you, of course, unfortunately have to do on your own. It would be nice if you were here so we could do it together. But regardless of that, let's just jump to the exercise and look at the first sentence. You have a set of two sentences next to each other. Men tend to give advice, full stop, and women often show concern and empathy. Let me try just to... No, let me try to get that, to do the focus. All right. Yeah. All right. I hope that's much clearer than before. So what we have here is men tend to give advice, and women often show concern and empathy. These are two sentences. You want to combine these two sentences by contrasting them with each other. And you should use one of these words in order to connect them with each other. What do we mean by that? Sorry. Okay. So you would say, you would rewrite the sentence, men tend to give advice and use one of these words to or phrases to contrast with the other sentence or the upcoming sentence. You could easily use whereas, or while, or in contrast, or however, or on the other hand. But this sentence, in my point of view, the word whereas would work better. Whereas women often show concern and empathy. So the basic idea is using a word such as whereas to connect this sentence here, sentence number 1, with sentence number 2, and make them one sentence. Is that clear? I hope so. Now let's try it again in sentence number 2. Women usually reveal a lot about their personal lives. Full stop. Another sentence. Men rarely discuss personal relationships and feelings. So these are two different or two separate sentences that you want to join. But they contradict each other. So you can say X usually goes to the right, B usually goes to the left. So they are, A and B, or X and Y, are two different people, and they have two different ways of doing things. So they contradict each other. They're different. So you would say X usually turns to the right. In contrast, B usually turns to the left. So in another way, you could use the word however as well. And you could also use the phrase on the other hand. So let's just try and do number 2 again, number 2 together, and rewrite it again. So I hope we can have good spacing here. So women usually reveal a lot about their personal lives. Okay? Sorry. Okay? So, if we wanted to use the word while men rarely discuss personal relationships and feelings. Okay? Very simple. What we did is join the two sentences and we used the word while. You have to understand that whereas, while, in contrast, however, and on the other hand all mean the same thing more or less. Okay? So it's just a matter of how to use them and when to use them. They mean the same thing. Okay? But sometimes using one in one context is better than another. So I just wanted to give you the basic idea as to how to do this. And there are 3 more sentences that I would like you to do on your own. And I'm sure you're going to find it very easy to follow and do. Now I'd like you to move to another page, and that is page 54. In this page, we will consider a couple of paragraphs, and it's a type of exercise that I want you to do on a daily basis. What do I mean by that? I mean, since you're studying English, you're majoring in English, you have to train your eyes to look for information and to look for specific questions as you read. So it's like you asking the author or the writer some questions as you read. The same way you would interrupt someone speaking to you in real life. So if you have a friend speaking to you or telling you a story, you would tend to interrupt him when you because some questions come up to you across your mind. Let me give you an example of that. If someone was telling you about an event that happened to him or her, you would tend to interrupt and say, for instance, when, what time, where, who is with you, that kind of thing. What time of day was it? Where did it happen? Isn't that... can you give me an example? I don't understand. Can you give me an example? So, when someone is speaking to you in that manner, you tend to interrupt him and or her in order to clarify some gaps of information that you need to follow what this person is saying. The same thing happens, the same thing should happen when you read something. You shouldn't read passively. You should read actively. Once you read, you kind of have to interrupt the writer by asking questions such as how, when, prove it, give me an example, when, that kind of thing, because you are reading consciously and with focus to understand and analyze the text in front of you. Of course, the writer knows that a conscious reader would do this, so he kind of anticipates and predicts what the reader is going to ask. So he jumps right out and actually answers the question where he predicts that a reader would ask. To clarify this, the exercise on page 54 gives us a chance to analyze such a paragraph. Now, if you look at the paragraph here, studying a well-developed paragraph, read the following well-developed paragraph and notice how the author anticipates, that means predicts, and answers the reader's questions in italics. Right. So, if we read through the paragraph together, one way in which men's and women's speech differs. So one way in which men's and women's speech differs is in the practice of interrupting. So notice that here there's a how. this how is predicted by the author that the reader would ask. So if the author goes and says, one way in which men's and women's speech differs is in the practice of interrupting, the author says, well, the reader is going to ask, how? So I should answer that question. Okay? So the author goes and says, studies have shown that men interrupt women much more often than they do other men, while women are less likely to interrupt either men or women. So, you see, there's this statement here that says one way in which men's and women's speech differ is in the practice of interrupting. Okay, fine. How is that? The writer predicts that you, as a reader, are going to ask this question. How does that happen? Okay, he says, fine. I'll answer you that question by saying, studies have shown that men interrupt women much more often than they do other men, while women are less likely to interrupt either men or women. So the reader says, well, okay, prove that. Prove it to me. That's what the author predicts. That's what the writer predicts the reader is going to say or ask. At business meetings, for example, men typically engage in competitive turn-taking or grabbing the floor by interrupting another speaker. How are women different then? Well, that's your question as a reader. Women, however, have been conditioned from childhood to believe that interrupting is impolite. So women have been raised with this condition, that if you interrupt, it's impolite. Explain further, please. Can you give me more examples? Can you explain this thing you're saying? Can you give me more examples? Instead, they sit for hours waiting for a turn to speak, while their male colleagues wonder if they ever have anything to say. What does this mean? This is another question that is asked by the reader. This not only demonstrates a gender difference in speaking, it also illustrates one of the reasons that men and women do not understand each other. So all of these questions should be asked by you when you read. When you read anything. You just can't believe anything you read, or say that anything you read makes sense or is well written. That's not the case. A very good written paragraph such as this one would predict what the reader is going to ask. Okay? So there are these questions that the writer said, well, the reader is probably going to ask me how. The reader is going to probably ask me to prove it. The reader is probably going to ask me to ask me how women are different from that, or how to explain, or they are going to ask me to explain further, or what that means. Right. Well, anyway, that's an example of a very well-developed paragraph, because a very well-developed paragraph is a paragraph that keeps the reader in mind. Okay? Remember that when people write, they are writing for an audience. They are writing for someone to read what they wrote. Okay? So they should put the reader in their thoughts, because it's important to deal with the reader and predict what he or she will ask and what he or she will try to look for. Okay. Now, let's move on to analyzing a paragraph, and that's the second exercise on the same page. The directions here say, read the following paragraph. It is poorly developed because the writer did not anticipate the reader's questions and answer them. Try to answer the reader's questions in italics yourself, and then, on a separate piece of paper, write the paragraph, developing it more fully. Of course, this is a very difficult task to do in like 5 minutes, but it needs some thought. And we're here to discuss these thoughts together. Okay? This is an example of a very bad paragraph that hasn't been developed. And of course, it's your task to develop it some more, just like the paragraph previously discussed. Now, one way to learn a foreign language, this is talking about learning a foreign language. We've had this before. One way to learn a foreign language is to watch the non-verbal communication of native speakers. Now, here the reader should ask why. Why should someone watch the nonverbal communication of native speakers in order to learn a foreign language? Now, the writer jumps and says, watch how people behave when they talk to each other. But then the question again is why? Why should I do that? But no answer. Observe the gestures they use and try to figure out what they mean. Okay, fine. Give me an example of those gestures. Are they hand gestures, head gestures, general body gestures? Give me an example, please. Fine. Let's see if the writer is going to give us an example. You can learn many things about people just by watching their behavior as they speak. Still no example. But we ask, even after the statement, why? What does this have to do with everything else you've said? So what the writer did here is he or she gave us very minimum examples and very minimum clarifications about the thoughts expressed in the paragraph. The mistake the writer fell into was that he or she did not predict what the reader is going to ask and include it in the paragraph. So this is very bad. So if you wrote this needs a lot of work. This needs more work. Why? Because you have to predict the reader's thoughts. What do we mean by that? Let's just read this again. One way to learn a foreign language is to watch the nonverbal communication of native speakers. Okay, fine. That's a very nice thesis statement, very nice topic sentence, but tell me why. The next sentence should tell me why one way to learn a foreign language is to watch the nonverbal communication of native speakers. The next sentence should be why this is good. Why? Why did you tell us this? But the reader here, the writer here, didn't mention why. He jumped to another idea. Watch how people behave when they talk to each other. That's another idea. Then again, why? Why? We ask the question, why should I watch people? Observe the gestures they use and try to figure out what they mean. Give me an example of a gesture. No example. You can learn many things about people just by watching their behavior as they speak. Why and what on earth are you talking about? How is this related to the rest? You didn't give any detail. You didn't predict what the reader is going to ask. You didn't put the reader in your thoughts and say, well, I have to take the reader by the hand and explain everything clearly and in detail. This is what you should keep in your mind when you write something. You have to be detailed and not jump from one idea to another. Okay. Finally, right. This is the example. This is the a picture of the page we were talking about, and for the people who didn't have a chance to get the book yet, and I would like you to move to page 55 and do this exercise on your own, where it's the other way around. You read through the paragraph. There are 3 areas of difference between men and women's communication styles. One area is using language to dominate versus using it to establish rapport. Question 2. Another area is in the use of declarative statements versus questions. That's question 3. Using and tolerating insults reflects another area of difference in question 4. Now, what do you do with all these questions? You have a list of lines, question 1, 2, 3, and 4, where you can write your question. What do you think a good question to ask the writer to include here? What would you want? Now, of course, the directions of this exercise, let's just read, sorry, we didn't do this. The writer of the following paragraph did not anticipate the possible questions the reader might have. Read the paragraph, then list the questions that a reader might ask after each sentence. Then rewrite the paragraph on a separate piece of paper. As you rewrite, improve it by answering the questions that you listed. You see, it's doing the exercise the other way around by reading the paragraph and then asking the question. Okay? Is that clear? So what would be a nice question to ask the author? Of course, this is an ill-formed paragraph. This is an example of a bad paragraph. It didn't put the thoughts of the reader in mind. So you, as a reader of this paragraph, would want some information. Would want some additional information. What would that be? Ask them, put them in a question form here, such as asking why, for example, or give example, how does that relate to the topic, that kind of thing. just as the two exercises we've done together explained. Try to do the same. I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much, and see you in the next lecture. Okay? Goodbye.